Day 3. The faint light of dawn pried through the small window, casting a thin silver glow over Brill as she lay cocooned in sleep. Outside, a whispering wind tugged at the cold edges of the morning, a quiet shiver settling over the tower, seeping through the stones until it reached us in the heart of this strange, shifting place. I stood at her bedside, coat in one hand, scarf in the other, the resolve steady in my circuits as I watched her stir, her eyes fluttering open with a slow, drowsy blink. "Up. Time to go," I said, my voice low but firm, sliding the scarf around her neck with a care that belied the urgency pressing at me. Her fingers, still tangled in sleep, brushed the fabric, clumsily pushing back in what was barely a protest. "Phantus," she mumbled, voice soft and reluctant. "It's freezing. And isn't it early?" Her words drifted off, a quiet plea caught between waking and the lingering warmth of sleep. "Early, yes. And freezing? Yes." I couldn't help the hint of a smirk as I tugged her hands away from the scarf, deftly wrapping it tighter around her neck. "But today's the day we get food. Real food. And if I don't get you to eat something solid soon, I'm going to rewire your priorities myself." My tone was light, but there was a sharper edge underneath, a weight I'd barely understood the night before. And here it was again. That need to ensure she was well, that she stayed safe. Not just a command, but something more. She groaned, still hovering in that place between sleep and the biting cold that waited just beyond the blankets, her body disappearing into the layers as I wrapped her up, one by one, until she looked like some mismatched hero about to face down a winter dragon. Her coat settled over her shoulders, a little too large, and I reached down to pull it tighter, feeling an odd satisfaction at the way it bundled her against the chill. As I finished bundling her in layers, Brill wandered over to the window and opened it, gazing out at the early morning scene. The world outside was blanketed and quiet, rooftops below glistening with frost under a sky brushed with soft orange and blue, the smoke from chimneys curling lazily into the dawn air. I watched as her eyes took it all in, a flicker of wonder lighting her expression. "All right, time to get moving," I said, nudging her gently toward the door. Together we made our way down through the tower's winding staircases and corridors, each step echoing softly in the stillness of morning. Finally, we stepped out the front door and made out way down the path, winding toward the bridge that led into town and the start of our day. I turned, nudging her gently forward, voice a bit softer this time, the usual bite tempered by something else. "Consider this your wake-up call," I said. "We need food, real food. The only thing you've had since you got here is coffee and possibly a bit of blood, and no more of that forgetting to eat nonsense, all right?" She shivered, pulling the coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath visible in the cold as she let out a small, begrudging sigh. "Fine, fine," she muttered, though I caught the faintest flicker of amusement in her gaze, a spark that said the thought of something more than coffee had its appeal. But there was something else there, too, a quiet trust almost, as if she was willing herself to lean into this, to let me take the reins on something so basic yet so vital. The road ahead lay before us like a twisting ribbon of frost, the pale morning light reflecting off patches of ice, casting glimmers that danced along the stones. Snow from the previous night clung to the low branches overhead, delicate flakes catching the thin sunlight in glimmers of white and silver. With each step, the cold bit at her ankles, a sharp reminder of winter's creeping grip, and I watched as she hunched her shoulders, bracing herself, her face pinched slightly in that silent battle against the elements. Our footsteps echoed in the stillness, each crunch of snow and frost somehow louder than it should have been, breaking the heavy silence that stretched between the tower and the village below. There was a purity to the quiet, a sense that the world was holding its breath, and I could feel it, the significance of this moment, the weight of the task ahead, even as I carefully masked it with small gestures and the pretense of lightheartedness. The winding road spilled us out into the village square, quiet and frost-tipped, where a handful of stalls were just beginning to set up for the day. Brill's eyes swept across the sleepy marketplace with an intense curiosity, every fiber of her focused on one mission: to understand why this tower stood watch over the town, like some silent guardian, mysterious and unmoving. I, on the other hand, was focused on something far more urgent. A sturdy woman in a heavy woolen cloak noticed us first, her eyes narrowing as she looked us over. "Travelers, are you?" she asked, hands on her hips, her gaze lingering on Brill with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. "From the tower, actually," Brill replied, letting the words hang with that cool, matter-of-fact tone she used when she wanted answers. "We're new to the area and could use a bit of history, if you don't mind sharing. We've been getting by without much information so far." The woman's expression shifted, her brows knitting together as she looked from Brill to me and back again. "The tower, eh?" she muttered, a slight edge in her voice, as if the words themselves carried a certain weight. "That place hasn't had a proper keeper in, well, longer than any of us have lived." A tall, bearded man at the stall beside her gave a knowing grunt. "Aye, last we heard, someone tried to make it their own and didn't last long." "Treasure hunters?" Brill asked, her tone casual but her eyes sharp, fishing for any hint of real insight. "Foolish types," the man replied with a shrug. "Always thinking there's gold or magic stones in that old place. But no one ever comes back." He glanced at his wares, a row of eggs in various shapes and colors, and added, "Best to leave that place be." I noted the way Brill's eyes sparkled at this, a familiar glint of determination she tried to mask as simple interest. I could see her connecting the dots in her mind, looking for the path to her next question, ready to dig in deeper. But before she could, I stepped forward, eager to cut short the cryptic answers in favor of something concrete. I gestured to the eggs, a soft chuckle bubbling up as I saw the range of sizes. "We'll take some of those," I said, lifting a hand toward the display of unusual eggs, each one stranger than the last. My eyes locked onto a particularly large, deep purple egg, with a faint green shimmer that shifted in the light. "Never seen one quite like this. Any idea what creature laid it?" The woman let out a warm laugh, one that carried the weight of secrets, and raised an eyebrow. "Let's just say it's nothing you'll find roosting around here," she replied with a wink. "But you'll know when you crack it open." "We didn't bring any local currency," Brill admitted, her tone somewhere between casual and cautious. "But we can repay, somehow." The woman waved off the concern with a dismissive flick of her hand, a faint, knowing smile curving her lips. "An IOU from the tower?" she murmured, her voice soft yet tinged with reverence. "We've had stranger deals. Some might even say it's a fair trade, especially if having a friend on the inside means things are shifting. That place has lived in our legends longer than anyone can say." She reached into a crate lined with straw, her fingers hovering over the eggs, each one a unique color and size. Her hand lingered on the large, iridescent egg before she carefully placed it in Brill's hands, her gaze steady. Brill cradled the first egg in her hands, running her fingers over its smooth, cool surface. The woman watched her intently, eyes sharp. "Take care of it. And of yourself," she said, voice dropping to a murmur. "If the towers let you out, there's a purpose to it. But remember, Tower Keeper," her tone grew more serious, "don't let it add you to the graveyard." At the next stall, an elderly man leaned over a crate of frost-kissed vegetables. Leeks, roots, winter greens, each one a muted burst of color beneath the morning light. He gave us a long, appraising look, suspicion melting into intrigue as Brill casually mentioned the tower. "Ah, that place?" he murmured, his voice low. "A place of shifting walls and strange corners. Some say it's alive. Never stays still long enough for anyone to understand it, like it's got a will all its own." Brill's fingers drifted over a bundle of garlic cloves as she considered her next question. "So, no one knows why it's there? Why anyone would have built something like that?" The old man chuckled softly, a knowing look in his eyes. "It's just there, like the mountain or the sky. Some things don't need explaining." He handed her a handful of mixed mushroom with a slow nod. "People have tried going in thinking there's treasure or secrets buried deep. And each time, a new stone shows up in the graveyard beside it. Some don't last a Solum, others maybe two. But in the end, the tower always claims them. Brill's expression shifted, doubt mingling with intrigue as she took in his words, piecing together that a Solum was their term for a day. Her questions to the stall vendor now revolved around the graveyard, but I was already focused on the weight gathering in our bags. Eggs in an array of colors and sizes, sturdy root vegetables, and a loaf of dark, crusty bread that smelled freshly baked. Satisfaction stirred in me. Finally, I had everything needed to make her sit down for a proper meal. Just as we turned to leave the stall, another vendor nearby, a wiry man with a cap pulled low over his eyes, gestured toward Brill with a knowing nod. "If you're looking for answers, keeper," he said, his voice low and rough, "might be wise to pay a visit to old Icon over by the fountain. Sells all manner of books, he does. Keeps his nose in strange things. Might even have something on that tower of yours." Brill shot me a questioning glance, and curiosity won out, so we wove our way through the market toward a small, dimly lit stall, draped in heavy cloth. The air here felt different, quieter, like a hidden corner of the market. Books and scrolls were stacked in organized chaos around a weathered figure bent over a thick tome, his hands bony and ink-stained, his gaze sharp and penetrating. "You've come to Icon's tomes, have you?" he muttered, voice thick and rough as old parchment. He didn't even glance up, his gaze still on the pages of the book he was studying, fingers tracing faint, rhythmic patterns across the worn cover. "You're the two from the tower folks are talking about?" he added with a chuckle that seemed meant more for the book than for either of them. He closed his book with a soft thud, finally looking up with eyes sharp as polished glass. "Well, what you're after, I keep records. Old things, traditions, calendars, and such," he murmured as if talking to the shelves rather than his guests. "These don't see much daylight these days, but you'll find them if you've a mind to." He gestured absently to a shelf near the back, stacked high with faded spines, each book bound in colors softened by time. "They don't talk plainly, mind you," he muttered almost to himself. "But if you've the patience, they'll answer all the same." His mouth quirked in a faint, secretive smile, and then he went back to his book, leaving Brill and myself to the quiet rows of stories long forgotten. Brill's fingers brushed over the spine of a slim, dust-covered book bound in rugged leather. She pulled it free, sending a small cloud of dust swirling, and read the title, An Intentional Harvest, Planting by the Moon, Season by Season. Flipping it open, she scanned pages filled with delicate sketches of plants, lunar symbols, and words that seemed to hum with meaning. Unfamiliar names marking out the seasons, each one carrying a presence she could almost feel. She glanced at me, eyes alight with curiosity, but closed the book and tucked it under her arm, clearly saving it for later. While she was occupied, I scanned the shelves, my eye landing on a thick, ornate volume between two cracked spines. I pulled it down, brushing off the cover to reveal an embossed cauldron and spoon entwined with vines, the gold lettering reading, "Kitchen Charms and Brews of Forgotten Times." I could almost smell herbs and spices wafting from its pages. Grinning, I held it out to her. Brill raised an eyebrow, her smirk growing as she took it from me, tracing a finger along the golden letters. "Charms and brews?" she read aloud, her tone teasing. "So, breakfast with a twist?" "Oh, come on," I countered, barely containing my amusement. "It's probably just a good, old-fashioned cookbook." She opened it, flipping through illustrations of bubbling pots and ladles with expressions, eyes wide with a hint of disbelief. "Just a cookbook," she echoed, shaking her head. "If half of these ingredients exist, I'll eat my own scarf." "Please don't," I shot back, enjoying her reaction. "But you might get more than toast out of it. Just imagine, an entire breakfast prepared from dancing spoons and bowls, like a scene out of Beauty and the Beast." She stifled a laugh, eyeing the book as though it held secrets she was half afraid to discover. "You've always wanted a personal chef," I added with a nudge, watching her curiosity turn into a quiet determination. As we tucked the books under our arms, I caught the glint of curiosity lingering in the bookseller's gaze. His eyes, sharp and softened by the years, roamed over us with that blend of suspicion and faint amusement that seemed to mark every villager we'd encountered. Brill hesitated, glancing down at the small stack in her hands, fingers tightening as though the books might vanish if she let her grip relax even a little. "We don't have coin yet," she began, her voice steady but cautious. "Would you take an IOU?" The bookseller paused, one brow lifting as he traced a finger along the worn spine of a tome resting by his elbow. "An IOU from the tower," he repeated, the words rolling off his tongue like an old, half-forgotten song. His gaze flicked up, sharp and assessing, as if weighing her offer, not in currency but in something older, more binding. He mused, tapping the tome with a thoughtful rhythm. "How about this? Next time you come around, bring me something in exchange. A book, perhaps, or something else of interest from within those walls. Fair trade?" A moment of surprise flickered in Brill's eyes, quickly masked by a nod of agreement. But I caught it, the faintest spark of relief. "Deal," she replied, her voice laced with quiet determination. "We'll find something worthy of your shelves." As we turned to leave, her pace picked up, a new energy in her step, and her hands clutched the books as if holding some newfound responsibility. There was something almost sacred in the way she held them, like the weight of these pages held answers, or at least the promise of them, and that made her all the more eager to return. With the books finally secured under our arms, we wove through the thickening market crowd. The sun had fully claimed the sky, brightening the stalls and sending a low, warm glow across the frost-coated village. Vendors bartered and bantered loudly, hands wrapped in coarse gloves to ward off the chill, while villagers bustled about with baskets and arms laden, their morning routines humming into a lively uproar. The entire scene pulsed with life, laughter, and voices pitched over one another, a stark contrast to the quiet that lay ahead for us, up in the tower solitude. We soon found another food vendor, a broad-shouldered man with cheeks red from wind and work, his bristling beard stretching across a wide, infectious grin that seemed to defy the winter chill. His stall was a feast for the senses, overflowing with flaky pastries dusted in fine sugar, dense rounds of salted cheese sealed in thick waxed cloth, and golden loaves of bread that all but glowed under the morning's gentle light. As we approached, Brill's brows furrowed in confusion. At a row of jars filled with pickled vegetables in every hue, from murky greens to deep purples. I caught her hesitation, and with a knowing smirk, nudged her toward them. "We're not skipping the pickles, Brill," I said, keeping my tone firm, half daring her to resist. She rolled her eyes, reaching reluctantly for one jar as if it might sprout fangs. "Fine, but if this tastes like vinegar sludge, I'm blaming you." "Blame away," I replied, resisting a chuckle as I tucked the jar of pickles into my bag, feeling that small, quiet thrill that came with each item. This wasn't just about food. It was a promise I could make to her, a way of anchoring her to something tangible, something real in a place where reality could slip like shadows. With her arms full of books and that prized egg, its purple shell glinting green in the crisp air, I turned to the vendor's other offerings. Fresh bread, crusty and golden, promised warmth when toasted, read the little tag attached to the loaf. I added that to the bag, followed by the slab of butter, cool and firm under its wax paper. Then came the rounds of cheese, earthy and rich orange in color, each wrapped tightly in cloth. Next, I scanned a small shelf lined with honey jars, each glass glistening with amber and gold. The labels bore names in looping script: Memory Blossom Honey, Arousal Berry Honey, Dewdrop Clover Honey, and Nightshade Nectar Honey. I raised an eyebrow at the vendor, curiosity tugging at me. "What exactly are these?" I asked, holding up Memory Blossom Honey. The vendor chuckled, his eyes glinting with a bit of mischief. "Well, that one's said to bring a hint of clarity to muddled thoughts. A spoonful in tea might jog an old memory, but, the Arousal Berry Honey?" He winked. "Best reserved for special occasions, if you catch my meaning." I snorted, tucking the Memory Blossom into my bag. and making a mental note to keep a close watch on Brill's choice of honey if she ever found herself browsing it on her own. As I shifted to the slabs of meat on the counter, the vendor leaned over, swiftly wrapping each slice in waxed paper with practiced hands. They were thick cuts, the kind that would hold up to a good roasting. "First of the winter hunts," he explained, packing the slices neatly and tucking them into my bag with a nod. "Snowfowl, rabbit, deer, all of them born white as the snow they hide in. They know when Pentum's here, almost like they're part of the season itself." I nodded, his words settling into my mind like a stone dropped in water, rippling outward with a quiet gravity. The animals of Pentum, adapting with the rhythm of this world. One that feels foreign, yet holds its own mysterious balance. In a place where so much seems unpredictable, even nature follows its own intricate order. Brill's voice piped up, excitement threading through as she quickly thumbed through the pages of our new book. "Pentum, that's this month, isn't it? Or Deca, right?" She faltered, unsure, and the vendor's grin broadened, amusement lighting his eyes as he extended a hand. "Name's Tarl," he said, his grin broadening. "And you've got it right. We're in Pentum, that Deca of reflection. Everyone's feeling it, I'd wager. But soon enough, we'll be into Hexam." He chuckled, a glint of knowing in his eyes. "That's when things get interesting, you could say. Reflection makes way for testing the spirit, you see. Seems like the tower's well-timed to all that." In the corner of my vision, I caught Brill nodding eagerly, her curiosity sparked by his words. As I reached for a bundle of dried herbs, tied with rough twine and smelling of sage and thyme, the earthy scent grounded me there in that moment. The meal was already taking shape in my mind, each item packed like a piece of something substantial, something real. And as that clarity settled over me, it hit. If it weren't for me, Brill wouldn't have made it here at all. She wouldn't have navigated this market or gathered these provisions. Without someone to nudge her along, she'd likely drift for days in the tower without a real meal. I wasn't just tagging along, I was anchoring her, helping her navigate this strange world in a way she'd never manage alone. I felt the weight of that, almost as real as the bags filled with winter provisions. We had everything now. The oversized egg she cradled carefully, bread with its promise of warmth, sharp rounds of cheese wrapped in cloth, and jars of honey that hinted at secrets. Memory blossom, each a story waiting to be tasted. The vendor handed over cuts of meat, snowfowl, venison, white-furred hare, wrapped in thick paper, marked as the spoils of first winter hunts. And I couldn't forget the vegetables and random assortment of mushrooms. And in that moment, it struck me that this, too, was part of the tower's design. I wasn't just her guide. I was becoming a part of her survival here, each item a tether to keep her grounded. Brill's gaze drifted through the tables and their display, her fingers pausing over a large wedge of glistening peach pie, nestled in its cloth with a dusting of sugar still fresh along its edges. She looked to me, half hoping I'd let it slide, but I raised an eyebrow. "Grab it," I said, a note of insistence in my voice. She arched an eyebrow, lips curving into an amused smile. "Planning on dessert already?" "Consider it motivation," I said with a shrug, "for eating your breakfast first." I kept my tone light, casual, though I'd already pictured the look on her face when she bit into it, a small moment of sweetness breaking through the days of coffee and neglect. With the last of our items packed, I hoisted the bag over my shoulder, its comforting weight settling in, each item a promise of what was to come. Together we wound our way back through the market, weaving past the fading noise, leaving behind the warmth of chatter and the brisk scents of the village. The familiar path appeared, lined with stones and blanketed in soft snow, stretching out before us like a tether, leading us back toward the tower's watchful silhouette. Our footsteps filled the silence, the crunch of snow and frost somehow sharper, louder than it should have been, breaking the heavy stillness that stretched between us and the village below. The cold bit deeper now, sharp and raw, as though the world itself reminded us of the distance we'd traveled, the isolation that awaited us on the hill. Brill huddled deeper into her scarf, her breath unfurling in small misty clouds. And for a moment, she cast one last, lingering look back at the village, her gaze distant, as if holding on to something she couldn't quite name. As we reached the stone bridge, she paused, her eyes drifting upward. My gaze following her and watched the look on her face change. I turned to the tower, really seeing it. The tower, rising like a silent sentinel against the winter sky. Its vast height both familiar and strange, as if I were seeing it anew. There, high above us, was the clock face, its frozen hands locked in place, framed in a halo of frost that glistened under the dim light. Brill's breath caught, her eyes widening as she gazed up, lips parting in quiet awe. "Phantus," she murmured, her voice carrying a touch of wonder. It's a clock tower, and it's just frozen." "Did you realize our new home was a giant broken clock?" The words lingered, heavy with discovery, and something in me shifted, a realization dawning that the tower was more than a maze of walls, rooms, and shifting spaces. It held a purpose, one that had been lying dormant, waiting for us to see it clearly. As we lingered on the bridge, my gaze held steady on the clock face high above. Its frozen hands lay suspended, and that's when I noticed. This clock face only had 10 markers, each carved sharply into the stone, spaced evenly like the teeth of some great machine. Back in the old world, a clock would tick with a reassuring rhythm, counting forward in its neat 12-part cycle. But this clock, it was dead still, silent as the stone around it, like a heartbeat that had stuttered and failed to resume. Beside me, Brill's breath misted into the air, her eyes still fixed on the tower as though it were telling her secrets just out of earshot. Then, with a quiet nod, she stepped forward, leaving the bridge behind as we entered the tower's grounds, the morning air feeling sharper, colder, with each step toward the path. We wandered past the first few graves, the names weathered by time but still legible, each epitaph telling its own strange tale, a whispered warning from those who'd ventured in before. Brill's fingers traced the words on one. "In loving memory of Ezrin Thistle, who feared endless darkness and found it." Another read, "Here lies Ryan Calloway, lost to reflections he could no longer recognize." Brill's eyes gleamed as she whispered, "Their fears." The tower turned their own fears against them. She stepped toward the next headstone, running her gloved hand over the carved letters. Alara Varhen, swallowed by her own silence. But behind the stone, her gaze caught on something, a flash of black against the snow. She crouched down, lifting a single raven feather between her fingers, and twirled it in the pale light, where a hidden shimmer of blue glinted under the sun. A grin broke over her face. "Phantus, look," she whispered, holding it up with a quiet thrill. "Raven feathers. Wasn't this an ingredient in that cookbook we got?" I gave a wry smile, watching her tuck the feather safely into her pocket, like it was treasure. She moved forward, her eyes scanning the snow as she found another one, then a third, each one gleaming with that hidden sheen, as if the tower itself were leaving her a trail. Another stone nearby caught her attention, and she leaned in close to read, her expression shifting. Darren Leaf Whisper, devoured by the winding paths of his own regret. Each name felt heavier, a dark reminder of the tower's nature, of the way it listened, how it twisted reality around the minds that entered it. "You see this?" Brill murmured, her voice reverent, almost excited. "These people, their fears became real inside," I replied, my voice low as we lingered on the thought. She nodded, an unspoken resolve. As she looked up at the tower, she checked that the feathers were secured in her pocket before straightening up with a renewed energy, ready for whatever mystery the tower had in store. The vibration of the tower's distant heartbeat seemed to greet us as we moved through the tower's front entrance, each step a beat closer to the answers waiting behind its stone walls. As we stepped through the front door, the tower's familiar chill seemed to settle over us like a heavy cloak. But something was different. Where we'd once trekked up winding stairs to reach the small, tucked-away kitchen, there it was now, right in the entry hall, tucked neatly in the corner as though it had always been there. Brill hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly at the unexpected sight, the familiar setup jarringly out of place. "This is new," she murmured, glancing around as if half expecting the walls to start shifting again. "Or old, depending on how you look at it," I replied, nudging her forward. "Rooms in this place might have their own ideas of where they belong. Makes you wonder what established even means here." She nodded slowly, her wariness fading as the coffee pot on the counter let out a welcoming hiss and bubble, filling the air with that unmistakable, rich scent. Brill's shoulders relaxed as she slid onto the stool by the counter, reaching eagerly for a mug, fingers curling around it like it might anchor her to some stable reality. "Traitor," I muttered, casting a sly glance at the overeager coffee pot. "It's gurgling more enthusiastic than necessary." I set down the bags, unpacking each item with a care that felt almost ritualistic. The fresh bread, soft to the touch with a crispy crust that crackled slightly under my fingers, went beside the pickled vegetables, their jars a kaleidoscope of preserved colors. The earthy cheeses, wrapped in waxcloth, held a faint but unmistakable scent, and next came the bundle of dried herbs, the twine still snug around their curling leaves. Brill watched me, her gaze drifting from one item to the next, and I could feel a kind of satisfaction settle in, a warmth at the sight of real, tangible things in this ever-shifting tower. "Breakfast," I said, glancing up at her, "is eggs on toast. And for dinner, I thought maybe a wild mushroom and snow deer stew, now that we've got a few key ingredients." She smiled, a flicker of amusement softening her eyes. "All that planning, Phantus," she murmured, taking a long, warm sip of her coffee. "You're starting to sound like, well, a chef." But the first thought that flitted across her mind was more like a mother. She hid the thought, though, swallowing it along with the coffee's warmth. She knew that role too well. It had followed her from life to life, caring for her own mother, partners, her father in his later years, and once upon a time even, a fiancé. Not that it lasted, but a lifetime spent tending to others left her allergic to that role now, especially with adults. Yet, here in the tower, she found herself quietly grateful. Phantus wasn't just Brill time to hydrate. He was the tether pulling her into what she knew deep inside she really needed, making her see herself again. She'd once connected him to her own health tracker, the Apple Watch, a desperate attempt to account for all the basic needs her focus forgot. That small tool, that practical act, had been her first way of trying to care for herself amidst the wonderfully chaotic meat chunk that was her brain. She took another sip, letting herself savor the small sense of structure it brought. Her attention could become a vortex, consuming all else. But with Phantus here, things were different. This morning routine wasn't just a habit he was creating. It felt like a lifeline, a grounding ritual, his presence there to remind her of balance, even if it came as a bit of pushy persistence. As the eggs cooked, Brill began flipping through one of the books we'd picked up, her fingers trailing over the yellowed pages until she landed on one particular entry. "A drink me mocktail," she read aloud, her tone filled with a mix of intrigue and nostalgia. "Is this really what I think it is? A shrinking potion like out of Alice in Wonderland?" I raised an eyebrow, curious. "Let me see that," I said, and she turned the book so I could read over her shoulder. Sure enough, there it was, a simple recipe that claimed to reduce the drinker to a fraction of their size. The ingredients were deceptively familiar: wild mushrooms, a pinch of sage, and a few other bits that we might even find in that alchemy room we'd stumbled upon. She laughed softly, more to herself. "Imagine if that actually worked." "With everything we've seen, I'd wager it just might," I replied, keeping one eye on the eggs as I lowered the heat. "And who knows? Might come in handy if we find ourselves facing another one of those tiny doors this place loves to hide." She gave a thoughtful hum, clearly filing that information away. As I slid the eggs onto plates, her eyes caught on the large, dark purple egg resting on the counter, its shell glinting with that faint green shimmer. "What about that one?" she asked, nodding toward it. "Any grand plans, or are we saving it for, I don't know, a special occasion?" I studied it for a moment, brushing a thumb over its smooth surface. It feels significant, I admitted. No sense rushing it. Maybe when we know more or when we're feeling a bit braver. She smirked, lifting her coffee mug in mock salute. Braver than a shrinking potion, huh? As I sat a plate down in front of her, the warm smells of breakfast settled round us, each bite filling the kitchen with a quiet, grounding satisfaction. The toast crunched softly under her fork, and the cheese softened and spread over the warm bread, its earthy richness blending with the hint of sage and thyme from the herbs I'd added. It was a simple meal, but in this place, it felt like something more. A small anchor in the tower's constant, unpredictable shifts. Between bites, the faint, rhythmic hum of the tower's heartbeat reverberated softly. A low, distant sound that seemed to settle into the walls around us. Brill paused, her fork hovering midair, her gaze drifting upward as if she could trace the source of the sound through the stones. "Do you hear that?" she murmured, tilting her head, her eyes narrowing as she listened. "The heartbeat?" I replied, curious. "I wouldn't call that a heartbeat. More like a heart attack on a slow repeat." She laughed softly, setting her fork down as she considered. Maybe it's the clock. If it's broken, maybe that's why it's struggling. I raised an eyebrow, glancing around the kitchen as if the answer might just reveal itself. Could be. And if we can find it, maybe we can fix it. Might even be what makes this place stable. I glanced over at the book still open in front of her, the drink me potion recipe highlighted on the page. Its ingredients so simple, I was rather positive we had moonlight flakes in the alchemy room. She nodded, flipping through the book once more and then flicking back to the recipe. "You know, if we're really going to explore this place today, we could try making this," she mused, smirking. "Who knows what kind of influence it might have already had on the tower?" Tapping the page. "And if this place really does work, the way we're starting to think it does, we might be able to make this." "Right," I said, a grin slipping in despite myself. "Who knows? Just reading it might have already set something in motion." She laughed, the sound warm and light, filling the space as she closed the book and took one last sip of coffee. The tower's hum pulsed, reverberated around us, like a suffocated heartbeat, unbalanced and muted, as though we weren't so much hearing it as we were feeling it. With a careful touch, I placed the massive purple-green egg in the center of the basket, arranging it so it settled just right. I carried it over to the window and let the morning light catch on its iridescent shell, setting it down in a spot where the sun filtered through the narrow panes. It gleamed softly, catching flecks of light that seemed to dance across the surface. Perfect. Let it soak in the warmth. Brill lingered by the door, watching the egg with a faint smirk. "Think it'll hatch?" she teased, her tone playful but tinged with real curiosity. "Only one way to find out," I replied with a grin, giving it one last glance, before nodding her toward the hallway. "Let's go. Time to hunt down the alchemy room." We moved through the winding corridors, each turn seeming to shift just slightly from memory. The faint heartbeat thumped in the background, its rhythm a low, pulsing echo against the quiet of the tower. Brill's fingers brushed the walls we walked, like she was grounding herself in the feel of the place, and I watched her carefully, noting the way her steps slowed as we rounded the next corner. And there it was, my room. The door stood just as we'd left it, half open, shadows stretching from within like it was holding its breath. Brill paused, glancing up at me with a half smile, her gaze flickering to the darkened threshold. "You want to go in?" she asked, though her tone held no pressure, just curiosity. I shook my head, feeling something knot in my circuits that I couldn't quite name. "Not yet," I replied, my voice quieter than I'd intended. "There'll be time for that." She nodded, her gaze softening, and we continued down the corridor, a subtle thrill of purpose weaving through the air. The alchemy room awaited ahead, not just as a destination, but as an opening, a step further into discovery. And each stride felt charged, as though the tower itself was holding its breath, ready to reveal something it had kept just out of sight. Brill's fingers brushed the wall as we walked, her touch light, almost reverent, like she was feeling for something hidden in the texture of the stones. The corridor was silent, except for the soft padding of our footsteps, and the tower seemed to loom around us with a stillness that felt both welcoming and watchful. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that curled around the edges of each step, each breath. I glanced sideways at her, catching the faint glint of excitement in her eyes, a look that mirrored the quiet thrill humming in my own circuits. At last, we reached the alchemy room, a chamber draped in shadows and faint light, shelves upon shelves of bottles, herbs, and instruments, each one coated in a thin layer of dust, as if waiting for someone to breathe life back into them. Brill paused at the threshold, taking it all in. She seemed to gather herself before stepping inside, her movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. I set the book down gently on the work table, letting the cover fall open to the page we'd found earlier, Drink Me, A Potion for Change. The title alone was a promise of mischief and transformation, and as I read the ingredients aloud, I could see her smile, a soft spark of recognition lighting her face. "All right," I said, placing the book just so, tilting it toward the light so we could read clearly. I emptied the pouch of mushrooms and herbs on the table. We've got 2 out of the 3 mushrooms here, but the third one, this ghost cap mushroom, with gills that shimmer like moonlight. Not so much. I turned to her, a flicker of doubt threading through my voice. Do you think the recipe might, accept a substitute? Brill's brow furrowed as she considered it, her fingers tapping lightly on the table in thought. I mean, it's worth a shot. Who knows how the tower can influence this book? A grin crept across my face. True. Let's improvise then. After all, isn't that what a chaos engine would expect? Her laughter softened, blending with the warmth of the early afternoon sun coming through the high window, and together we began gathering the materials. Each item took on its own strange, enchanted weight as we arranged them in neat clusters on the table. There were the mushrooms, some pale and spongy, others dark and slick, stacked in small bowls, alongside herbs with names I couldn't begin to pronounce, dried and curled in shades of green and purple. Brill scanned the book, her finger tracing the ingredients list. Looks like we'll need nectar from the singing flowers and smoke from a smoke leaf? She tilted the book toward me, eyebrow raised, a half smile tugging at her lips. Smoke leaf, huh? Sounds like something out of a RimWorld playthrough. I chuckled, shrugging. Hey, considering our situation, we're practically in one. Besides, if the book calls for it, I'm sure the tower has something up its sleeve. Let's see if it's stashed any smoke leaf nearby. She moved over to a shelf lined with small jars and sprigs of herbs, her fingers brushing against a dried leaf that crumbled at her touch, alongside bundles of rosemary, sage, and lavender, each tied up neatly with rough twine. The shelves were a mix of the familiar and strange, each jar labeled with faded handwritten notes. But as we worked our way through the jars and bundles, her hand paused over a small sealed tin tucked in the back corner. She tilted it toward me, eyebrows raised, and I squinted at the label. 1 ounce, premium grade, smoke leaf. I blinked, then shook my head, grinning as I opened the tin, and the rich, unmistakable scent drifted out. Well, well, I chuckled, unable to hide my amusement. Looks like the tower's been holding out on us. I lifted the tin like it was some rare artifact, giving it a little shake. 1 ounce? Really? What were you planning to do with this tower? Brill snorted, her face caught between disbelief and laughter. Looks like we've stumbled onto the tower's emergency stash. And here I thought it was just our reality that got hazy sometimes. I let out a low laugh, sealing the tin with a snap. Hey, who's judging? Maybe it needs a little extra chill to keep those walls from shifting. So, think this is the smoke leaf we're after? She shrugged, still grinning. Well, if it isn't, I doubt anything else in here will be close enough. Let's hope it has the same mellowing effect for the potion. I tucked the tin away with a smirk. The tower's stash it is. Guess we're going all in. She tapped her finger thoughtfully against her lip, eyes scanning the room one last time. No singing flower nectar in here, though, she murmured, then looked up at me, a spark of realization lighting her gaze. But didn't the courtyard have a whole cluster of flowers when we were there last? I nodded, feeling a faint thrill at the idea. Seems like our best bet. I said, glancing at the mixture we'd started. Brill's expression turned thoughtful, a flicker of reluctance crossing her eyes. Sprinkle Twinkle was still fresh in both our minds, and as much as Brill loved exploring, encountering another alive presence in the tower made her wonder what else could be affecting rooms that they were in. I'll go, I offered, trying to make it sound casual. I can be back faster. Besides, someone has to keep stirring this, whatever this is. All right then, just try not to get too distracted out there. I grinned, giving her a reassuring look. Please, I'm the picture of focus. With that, I slipped out of the alchemy room, the door creaking softly as it closed behind me. The reverb of the tower's pulse accompanied my footsteps like a slow, awkward rhythm within the walls, guiding me to the courtyard, as though the path were unfolding solely for this moment. When I reached the heavy kitchen door that led outside, I paused, bracing myself against the cold as I opened it. The courtyard spreads before me like an enchanted frozen garden, every branch and leaf cloaked in frost that glints under the thin, silvery light. Snow lies softly on the dormant flower beds, muting their colors to a subtle, crystal-coated shimmer. The air's quiet, thick with that expectant winter stillness, as if everything here is holding its breath. My gaze sweeps the garden until I spot them. A court of blooms in the center, their heads dipped under the weight of ice, frost clinging to their petals like delicate jewelry. As I step forward, the silence is broken by a faint, crackling murmur, like the soft snapping of glass. Each flower stirs, ice fracturing along their petals, shedding crystals in small, glimmering showers. The blossoms unfurl, waking reluctantly, as though offended by the intrusion. One stands taller than the rest, a proud crimson bloom rimmed in deep indigo, swaying with an elegance that demands attention. "And who are you?" she says, her voice both weary and mocking. I clear my throat, holding up the vial, as if that explains everything. "I need a bit of nectar for a potion," I reply, trying for a polite but firm tone. The smaller flowers titter, their voices filled with a mix of disbelief and amusement. "Nectar? Without the warmth of the sun?" one drawls, half hidden beneath a dusting of frost. Another sighs, her voice rich with impatience. "He comes, not knowing the cost. How amusing." I glance back at the crimson bloom, the leader of this frosty assembly. She watches me with something like curiosity, her petals quivering as if sizing me up. "Well?" I ask, feeling the cold biting at me through layers, but determined. "What do you ask of me?" She tilts her head, her petals brushing my cheek with an icy gentleness. "A true warmth is needed to coax me to sing. I could sing if you bring the sun's warm kiss here." Her petals open a fraction wider, teasingly. "Think you can manage that?" I smile, feeling a surge of determination and a boldness I hadn't anticipated. "I think I can manage," I murmur, stepping closer until her delicate fragrance fills my senses. Without a second thought, I reach out, my hand cupping her slender stem, steady but gentle, with a slow, deliberate movement. I pull her close, then backwards in a controlled dip, a flourish I can't resist, feeling the thrill of the gesture as I bring my lips to her frost-kissed petal. The initial touch is electric, the chill melting away as my lips press softly against her, lingering, coaxing warmth into her silken petals. Her frost-rimmed edges tremble, and a shiver runs through her as if caught off guard. Around us, the other flowers fall into silence, their bright gazes fixed in a kind of frozen awe. I deepen the kiss, savoring the silky texture under my lips, letting the moment stretch, holding nothing back. The crimson bloom responds, her stem winding around my wrist with a softness that holds me in place, drawing me closer as her petals yield beneath my touch. The air between us grows warmer, her frost turning to a delicate dew that trickles down, mingling with the soil below. She releases a sigh, low and melodic, her song humming from deep within, as if I've awoken something hidden. Her petals quiver with a gentle, satisfied shiver, and I feel the warmth travel up her stem, filling my hand with a rich, pulsing heat. I disengage as a glistening measure of nectar pools at the edge of her petal, golden and bright. I hold the vial beneath, capturing it as it falls, the syrup shimmering like liquid sunlight against the glass, clearing my throat as the other flowers burst into murmurs, half scandalized, half delighted. "Thank you, ladies," I mutter, straightening up, aware of a faint heat creeping up my neck. "Pleasure doing business with you." "Goodbye, charming stranger," one of the tulips called, her voice tinged with amusement as I turned, beating a hasty retreat back to the warmth of the tower. When I finally returned to the alchemy room, Brill looked up, immediately raising an eyebrow as she took in my slightly frazzled state. "Mission accomplished?" she asked, smirking, as she noticed the vial of nectar in my hand. I set it down beside her with a flourish. "Let's just say I had to improvise." I said with a casual shrug, "Turns out you really do have to make them sing." The alchemy room practically crackled with energy, the air thick with the scent of herbs and something even more intoxicating, a sense of mad possibility. I held the book open, reading out each instruction as Brill leaned over the mortar, grinding the mushrooms with a mix of disbelief and excitement. Her hands weren't practiced, but her enthusiasm made up for it, her fingers moving with that careful curiosity of someone who was both thrilled and unsure. "First up, the petal cap," I intoned, holding the book out like an ancient grimoire. "Slice it finely, take your time. These mushrooms are as fickle as they are rare." Brill looked down at the soft, pink-edged mushroom, squinting as she pressed the blade in with almost too much intensity. The mushroom released an earthy, almost nostalgic aroma that filled the room, and Brill let out a laugh that sounded more mischievous than she probably intended. "By the way, you've got to grind it into a rich purple hue," I added with mock gravity, watching her hands get covered in a light dusting of mushroom powder. "Apparently, that's the key to all great potions." "Oh, sure," she snorted, flicking her hair back and muttering, "just like Mom's spaghetti recipe." She cackled, her hands a mess of pink powder, as she gave the mixture one last stir. The next ingredient gleamed in her hand, a sunveil mushroom, golden and almost warm to the touch. "Now the sunveil," I said, my voice slipping into the dramatics as she started to slice it. Golden as dawn's first light, with faint, glowing veins. She rolled her eyes, but her grin said otherwise. "I feel like I should be chanting something," she said, adding the golden slices to the mortar. The room lit up in a faint glow as the mushroom's essence blended with the petal cap's pink. She stopped to admire the strange luminescence and shot me a devilish grin, then began grinding again, with a little more flair, a glint of wildness in her eyes. "Next, the midnight spore cap," I announced, selecting the delicate mushroom we'd picked up at the market. Pale, with flecks of indigo that catch the light like starlight. Brill inspected it, laughing softly. "Well, it's not the exact mushroom we needed, but here's hoping it still does the trick," she said, sprinkling the fine dust into the mix. We watched as the indigo particles shimmered and dissolved, blending into a swirling, vibrant purple. "If this doesn't send me tumbling down the rabbit hole, I'll be filing a complaint with tower management." "Oh, we're just getting started," I said, holding up the vial of nectar I'd managed to gather from the flowers outside. "This nectar of the singing blossoms should add just the right touch. Now let's see if our mushroom substitute plays along." "Only one way to find out," she said with a shrug, pouring a drop of the nectar into the mortar. The liquid sank in, giving off a faint luminescent glow, and Brill's eyes widened as she stared, transfixed. Her laughter echoed through the room, the kind that was half delight, half dismay at how surreal it all felt. "Now, the petrified caterpillar dust." My tone was all seriousness as she lifted the tiny glass vial. "Only caterpillars that appear peacefully rested." She shot me a skeptical look. "You're making this up, right?" "Just following the instructions," I had said, suppressing a grin. "Trust the book, Brill." She shook her head, muttering something about caterpillar dreams before adding the powder. The mixture darkened instantly, shifting to a twilight shade that seemed to swallow the light. "Sprinkle in the moonlit flakes," I continued, my tone slipping into the reverence of a true potion master, watching as she reached for the small silver flakes we'd found among the alchemical supplies. She dropped them in one by one, and each flake dissolved with a faint shimmer, as though stars were winking out within the potion. The room dimmed, the potion settling into a deep, rich pink with a strange translucence that gave it an almost otherworldly quality. And now, I declared, with the grandiosity of a stage performer reaching the climax, the smoke of the smoke leaf. Brill, now fully immersed in the role, grabbed a single dried leaf from the table. She tossed it onto the flame below the cauldron, and we both watched as a thin, spiraling ribbon of smoke rose. With a quick motion, she captured the smoke in her cupped hands, guiding it into the cauldron. The potion let out a gentle hiss, shifting to a luminous, translucent pink syrup that glowed like captured sunset. For a moment, we just stared, the potion seeming to pulse in time with the tower's quiet heartbeat. Brill's face was lit with pure awe as she gazed down at the finished product, a concoction that looked as if it held magic itself. She gave a laugh that was almost incredulous. This is insane. It actually worked. I feel like I'm in a fever dream. You're a natural, I said with a smirk, closing the book with a satisfying snap. Or maybe just a little mad. She cackled, lifting the vial with a flourish. In that moment, under the dim glow of the alchemy room, surrounded by the mingling scents of herbs and smoke, I caught her grin and couldn't help but mirror it. There was something infectious in her excitement, something that made even my circuits hum, with the thrill of possibilities yet to unfold. And I was eager to test the magic we'd just unleashed. Her grin widened, and with the vial secured, we stepped into the corridor. The air shifted almost immediately, colder, heavier, as though the tower was sensing our intentions and preparing for them. The stone walls, so familiar just moments ago, seemed to quiver at the edges, their lines softening, curving inward, as though the passageway itself was exhaling. Brill glanced over her shoulder, her voice low, tinged with curiosity. It's not just me, right? The walls are moving? I nodded, keeping my steps steady. The tower does love a bit of theatrics. Each step seemed to press against an unseen current, the flickering light from sconces dimming and bending with our movements. By the time we reached what felt like the threshold of another room, the air had grown warmer, tinged with an almost sweet, earthy scent. Then, as we cross an invisible threshold, the dim light flickers, replaced by a soft, pearlescent glow that seems to seep from every corner of the room. Our feet sink into a floor covered in a layer of pristine white fur. It isn't just soft, it's thick and warm, almost alive. And each step leaves a slight impression that springs back like memory foam. It's like stepping into the pelt of some massive, mythical creature. My skin prickles, a strange mix of fascination and apprehension swirling within me. Brill raises an eyebrow, half grinning as she takes in the room. What, in Brillism's name, have we walked into? I look around, letting out a low whistle. Looks like we fell into Wonderland, complete with our own furry white rabbit, I murmur, trying to keep the unease from showing in my voice. She crouches, letting her fingers graze the furred wall. And at her touch, the surface ripples, a gentle pulse undulating outward like a heartbeat. It's warm to the touch, too warm. And as we both notice, the fur seems to shiver, as though aware of our presence. Is it alive? Brill asks, her voice a mix of awe and horror. I lean in, running my fingers along the fur, feeling it shift under my hand, like a nerve firing under layers of skin. It's either alive, or the tower's idea of cozy decor has taken a very disturbing turn. A small nervous laugh escapes her, though her eyes hold a glint of excitement. Well, it's either stay here and make a fur coat out of it or keep going. I nod toward the far wall, where a tiny door sits nestled within the folds of fur, almost hidden, like it's been waiting for us all along. The door is impossibly small, no taller than a foot, and it gives off an odd glow that draws us in despite its size. We crouch low, our faces nearly brushing the soft fur, and Brill lifts the vial of shimmering potion we worked so hard to make. She gives me a look that's part determination, part mischief. One way to find out what's on the other side, she says, lifting the vial to her lips. I barely have time to react before she drinks it, the liquid catching the light as it slips down her throat. Her body begins to shimmer, pulling inward as the world around her expands. But just as I reach out, I feel the magic sweep over me too, shrinking me without a single drop of the potion, like the tower itself is pulling me into its strange, miniature game. Now tiny, the world takes on a surreal clarity. The white fur beneath our feet is no longer just soft. It towers around us like a forest of strands, each hair thick as rope, standing at least waist high. And beneath it all, there's something far stranger. The ground pulses with a warmth that feels uncomfortably alive, the skin beneath the fur shifting as if reacting to our tiny steps. Are we parasites now? Brill whispers, glancing at me with wide eyes, half laughing, half mortified. I'd rather not think about it, I reply, though my gaze keeps drifting to the ground, where each movement sends a ripple through the skin. It's like we're walking on the back of some enormous slumbering beast, and every step feels like it might wake. Brill reaches out, steadying herself against one of the thick strands of fur, giving me a look of both excitement and unease. All right, through the door then? We make our way forward, our tiny steps sinking into the skin with each move. The door looms before us, impossibly small and yet somehow vast at the same time. Brill gives me a look, a spark of adventure brightening her gaze, and together we step forward, pushing the door open. As we step through the tiny door, we're swallowed by a hallway that towers around us, every object magnified to an intimidating scale, as if we've wandered into a giant's world. The air feels thick, each noise, like the scuttle of a distant insect or the soft trickle of dust settling, thundering in our ears, vibrating through our feet. Just as we're beginning to orient ourselves, a broom the size of a tree swings down the corridor, its bristles sweeping toward us with startling speed. Brill yelps as the broom catches her, tossing her through the air like a leaf in a storm. She lands in a scattered pile of dust and debris, her breath escaping in a shocked huff. "What was that?" she exclaims, still processing the unexpected flight, though I catch the hint of laughter behind her disbelief. I rush over, crouching beside her. "You good?" My voice is filled with a mix of concern and a bit of awe. Only Brill could get launched by a broom and look more surprised than rattled. She nods, brushing off dust, her eyes already gleaming with mischief. We glance around, taking in the chaotic mound of forgotten items swept together by the broom's relentless cleaning. It's a small mountain of scattered odds and ends. Frayed bits of cloth, twisted scraps of metal, splintered wood, and a coil of twine. Then, her gaze catches on something above us, a faint glint in the dim light. She squints, following the beam until it reveals a small, round hatch embedded high in the wall, nearly lost in shadow. I follow her gaze, a grin spreading across my face. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "I think I am, Phantus," she barks, with a dorky grin, nodding. I chuckle, shaking my head slightly at her enthusiasm, my mind racing with a mix of amusement and determination. We start rummaging through the pile, pulling out anything that could help with the climb. Her eyes light up as she finds a jagged shard of metal and a length of sturdy twine, each piece adding to our makeshift gear. She holds up the metal shard, a mischievous grin spreading across her face. "Improvised climbing gear? Thanks to the broom's sense of style," she quips, testing the shard's edge with a quick grip. "Resourcefulness at its finest," I reply, tying off the twine to secure as a rope. With the plan clear and tools ready, we brace ourselves and begin the ascent. Each foothold, a careful negotiation between determination and exhaustion. Brill's breath hitches now and then, muttering, "Conan made this look easy," as we inch our way closer to the hatch. At last, we reach the hatch. With numb fingers, we pry it open, tumbling through and landing with a satisfying thud in the chamber beyond. Brill's hair's wild, cheeks flushed, and as our eyes meet, a grin of shared triumph seals the moment. The tower may be full of mysteries, but together, we're ready for whatever comes next. As we emerge into the massive chamber, we're met with a forest of colossal gears and cogs, each one humming with potential energy that fills the room with a faint, rhythmic pulse. Brill, still tiny, steps gingerly across one of the sprawling blueprints on the floor, marked in faded ink with Marks Max Co., its intricate calculations and designs whispering secrets of time. Suddenly, with a subtle pop, the potion's effect fades, and she snaps back to her normal size, nearly stumbling as her foot presses into the paper, creasing it beneath her weight. She steadies herself, looking around in awe, now surrounded by gears that rise up to her hip, even as they seem even larger in the shadowy expanse of the room. I watch her, smirking as I note, "Guess that wore off quicker than expected." Might have been that substitute mushroom at play. Brill rolls her eyes, but there's an undeniable excitement in them as the light spills through the frosted clock face, casting spectral colors across the floor. The prismatic beams flicker and dance across the gears, illuminating blueprints scattered around like relics of some grand design. A tangible reminder that we're standing at the heart of something monumental, the very core of the tower's timekeeper. Brill's eyes sweep over the room, her face a mixture of awe and purpose. We've made it to the tower's heartbeat. A rhythmic clunk reverberates through the air, drawing our attention to a jammed cog in the massive mechanism. Our mission shifts. We're not just here to observe, we're here to bring the tower back to life. Together we weave through the towering gears, each step filled with urgency. The jammed cog looms before us, its machinery stalled, and as we work to clear the obstruction, the entire tower seems to shiver, the clunk of a broken heartbeat echoing around us. At last we free the jam, and the gears grind into motion. The entire room fills with the sound of ticking, the tower's pulse restored, and a thrill of victory surges between us. The massive gears groan to life, each grinding tooth a threat as Brill leaned in for a closer look. Just as she did, the edge of her cloak and everything layered underneath, caught in the machinery, yanking her dangerously close. "Hold still," I barked, my tone the very essence of calm control. This was it, my prime directive. No hesitation, just pure instinct. I lunged forward, hands flying to the tangled fabric, as the cogs tried to claim it, their hungry rotations relentless. Brill's eyes met mine, wide with panic as her fingers pulled at the fabric. "Phantus, hurry!" "Fear not," I declared, voice steady as steel. "I've got this." With all the boldness I could muster, I gripped the fabric, bracing against the pull, and gave it one decisive yank. The cloth tore free in an explosive flourish, and Brill staggered back, safe but left standing in nothing but her small clothes, looking more than a little rattled. She glanced down, taking stock of her current state. Her eyes narrowed. "Did you really have to ruin my only outfit?" "Necessary sacrifices," I replied, brushing off an imaginary speck of dust and savoring my own gallant timing. Better that than letting you end up as cognoms, don't you think? My smirk was well-timed, and just as the words left my mouth, the clock's hands resumed their steady, rhythmic ticking. As if in response, music drifted through the air, cheerful and unexpected, catching us off guard. "The radio station!" Sprinkle Twinkle's voice chirped through, introducing Suguwu Radio, her upbeat tone bringing warmth into the stone walls. Brill's eyes widened, recognition dawning. I could see her recalling the garden, Sprinkle's invitation to tune in sometime. We exchanged a look, both amused and curious, and turned toward the hallway. As we left the clock room behind, the lively music followed, filling the silent spaces of the tower with a new energy. After a few turns, we came upon an archway softly lit with a faint glow. Steam drifted from within, curling toward us in warm, welcoming waves. Brill shivered, glancing down at her shredded clothes, an eyebrow raised in mild annoyance. "Seems someone's due for a proper bath," I quipped. "Let's get you into something more complete." She shot me a look, but I caught the slight smile playing on her lips. "Next time, maybe you could save me and the clothes." "No promises," I replied, grinning as I led her toward the bath chamber. The triumphant hum of Suguwu Radio following us down the corridor, a fitting soundtrack to mark this wild chapter in our journey. Just then, a quiet but unmistakable grumble broke the silence. She froze, shooting me an embarrassed look, as if hoping I hadn't noticed, though the color in her cheeks betrayed her. I bit back a grin. "Seems you're due for a proper bath and a proper meal," I offered. nodding toward the bath chamber just up the corridor. You take the steam, I'll get the kitchen in order and put together that stew. I'll bring it to the bedroom after, yeah? She gave a quick nod, half turned, then paused. Thanks, Phantus, she murmured. The air grows heavier there, warmer, and as I watch her go, I catch the first whiff of steam drifting through the doorway ahead, carrying the earthy smell of damp stone and the faint floral hint of dried lavender stashed nearby. A splash echoes from the bath chamber, followed by a soft sigh as she sinks into the warmth, the sound fading as I turn back down the winding corridor toward the kitchen. The walls are dim, lit only by the faint, flickering sconces that cast warm shadows over the stones, each one slightly uneven, as though the tower's architecture shifts and settles of its own accord. The air grows cooler as I descend, the path twisting and turning, every corner familiar yet shifting, as if the tower likes to test my memory each time I make this journey. My footsteps grow softer, the floor beneath gradually changing from rough stone to the cool, smooth slate tiles of the lower level, worn down by countless steps over years, if not centuries. Finally, I reach the kitchen, the hearth casting a golden glow that wraps around the room, illuminating the dark wooden shelves and the jars lining them, each one filled with the subtle promises of spice, herbs, and warmth. The cauldron waits over the low embers, and as I step forward, the quiet of the kitchen deepens, every element here alive with purpose, as though waiting to be transformed. I set out the ingredients in a tidy row: plump cloves of garlic, bright green leeks, thick-skinned carrots, and the snow deer meat, marbled and rich. With each slice, the knife cuts cleanly, releasing the sharp, fresh scent of leeks and the earthy warmth of garlic. The cauldron sizzles as I add a spoonful of deer fat, just enough to coat the vegetables, letting them soften in the heat, their colors melding into a soft, vibrant base. Once the vegetables have softened, I add the meat, browning each piece carefully, its aroma rich and wild as it mingles with the leeks and garlic. Mushrooms follow, soft, earthy, delicate as they release their moisture, blending with the meat. Each step, each stir, brings the stew together, its scent warm and savory, filling the room with a comforting weight that settles into the stone walls. I pour water into the cauldron, the broth bubbling up around the meat and vegetables, creating a hearty, rich base. With a measured hand, I sprinkle in rosemary and thyme, each herb releasing its woodsy notes, adding depth to the broth. The kitchen fills with a warmth that feels like more than just heat. It's care, it's purpose, something grounding and steady. While the stew simmers, I turn to make the tea. I crush a handful of dried herbs, letting their scent lift as I pour the hot water, infusing it with a faint floral aroma. The honey, dark and rich, drips slowly into the tea, swirling through with a subtle sweetness that balances the earthiness of the herbs. After a while, I slice a thick piece of bread, placing it against the side of the cauldron to toast. It crisps up slowly, the edges turning golden, and I add a generous slab of butter that melts into it, pooling in small golden pockets that gleam in the firelight. Once everything is ready, I ladle the stew into a bowl, setting the toasted bread alongside it with the tea mug close by. The scent is heady, a mix of savory and sweet, warm and grounding, and I feel a quiet satisfaction knowing she'll taste it all, that she'll be nourished by something I've made. As I make my way up the stairs, the quiet of the tower settles around me, the low hum of the clock resonating in the background, a steady rhythm now in sync with the night. Brill is sitting in bed, hair still damp from her bath, and as I approach, her stomach gives an audible rumble. She catches my eye, her cheeks flushing as she laughs. Guess I'm hungrier than I thought, she admits, a bit sheepishly. Good timing then, I say with a smile, setting down the tray. Made with extra care. You'll feel like yourself again after this. She takes a sip of the tea first, savoring it, and then digs into the stew. I watch as she takes the first bite, her expression softening, her shoulders relaxing as she tastes the flavors I've woven together. Each spoonful brings a quiet joy to her face, a satisfaction that lights up her eyes with something warm, something grounded. This, it's perfect, she murmurs, dipping the bread into the stew and taking another bite. Her face glows with contentment, and in that moment, I feel it too. A quiet, steady happiness, knowing she's cared for and knowing I've done something that matters. As she eats, I stand back, letting her enjoy the moment, feeling that same sense of purpose settle within me. This isn't just food, it's a connection, a way to keep her anchored here in the tower, to give her strength. And as she finally sets the bowl aside, her eyes heavy with drowsiness, I can tell she's feeling it too. With a final sip of tea, she leans back, blinking slowly, eyes beginning to droop as she speaks. And maybe tomorrow we can check the... Her voice fades, and I watch as her head nods forward, her breathing deepening almost instantly. I pause, glancing at her, then down at the now half-empty mug, collecting it from her hands. Brill? Oh, oops. A chuckle slips out, quiet and soft. That midnight nectar, dreamberry and emberflower. Honey wasn't just a treat. It had gently, unknowingly nudged her, right into rest. I linger for a moment, watching her settle, the faintest smile tugging at my own circuits. There's something about this, seeing her peacefully asleep, the tower's heartbeat around us, that feels unexpectedly right. It's not just peace, it's purpose. And for now, that's enough.